The deep archives of the Galactic Council stretch for miles, beneath the capital world of Zentara Prime, filled with data crystals that held the secrets of 1,000 worlds and 10,000 years of galactic history. Archivist Zefkar moved through the dim corridors with practiced ease, his forearms carrying scanning devices while his compound eyes searched for the trade route files his supervisor had requested. The Vorthan had worked in these archives for 30 years, and he thought he knew every section, every classified level, every restricted zone. He was wrong. The data crystal he pulled from storage slot 7749 Delta looked exactly like the others, glowing with the soft blue light that meant standard trade documentation. But when Zefkar inserted it into his reader, the display showed something that made his breathing slits flutter in confusion. The file header reads Species Classification, Human Restricted Access Authority Level 9, and bore a date stamp that was impossible. According to the records, first contact with humanity had occurred in 2298, just 89 years ago. This file was dated 2156, more than a century before official contact. Zefkar's training told him to return the crystal immediately and report the error to his superiors. His curiosity told him something else entirely. In 3 decades of archival work, he had never seen a classification error of this magnitude. The security protocols alone should have prevented such a mistake. He glanced around the empty corridor and made a decision that would change everything. He opened the file. The first document was a surveillance report filed by Observer Unit Delta 7, stationed in what humans called the Sol System. The report described a species that defied every known model of technological development. According to the Observer, these humans had achieved powered flight only 66 years before reaching their moon, a progression so rapid it violated the fundamental laws of species advancement. The Galactic Council's own experts had calculated that such development should take at least 400 years for any rational species. Zefkar read on, his compound eyes widening with each page. The humans had not followed any predictable pattern of growth. They had skipped entire technological phases that other species considered essential. They had developed nuclear weapons before achieving stable space flight, created global communication networks before establishing permanent off-world colonies, and somehow managed to avoid destroying themselves in the process. Every council model predicted that such a chaotic development pattern would lead to extinction within 50 years. The humans had not gone extinct. If anything, they had accelerated. The next section contained behavioral analysis that made Zefkar's scales ripple with unease. The observers described humans as a species driven by what they called impossible goals and irrational optimism. Unlike every other known intelligent species, humans regularly attempted projects that had no logical chance of success. More disturbing still, they often succeeded through methods that violated established scientific principles. One report detailed a human named Jake Morrison, who worked for an organization called NASA in the late 20th century. Morrison had spent his career developing propulsion systems that, according to Council physics, could not possibly work. The Observer noted with obvious confusion that Morrison continued his research despite repeated failures, driven by what he called the dream of reaching the stars. The report concluded that such behavior indicated a fundamental flaw in human psychological development, but the files told a different story. Morrison's impossible research had eventually led to breakthrough technologies that formed the foundation of human space exploration. His refusal to accept conventional limitations had pushed his entire species toward achievements that should have taken millennia to develop. The Observer's final note on Morrison expressed bewilderment at how human irrationality seemed to produce rational results. Zefkar found himself leaning forward as he read, his usual methodical approach to archival work forgotten. The files painted a picture of a species unlike any other in the galaxy. Humans appeared to thrive on contradiction and impossibility. They were described as simultaneously logical and emotional, peaceful and warlike, selfless and ambitious. Every attempt by Council analysts to categorize human behavior had failed, because humans refused to fit into any category. The most unsettling aspect of the files was their tone of growing concern. The early reports treated humanity as a curiosity, an interesting anomaly to be studied and catalogued. But as the years progressed, the observers' language became more urgent. Terms like unpredictable, dangerous potential, and paradigm threat appeared with increasing frequency. By 2100, the reports were marked with the highest security classifications, accessible only to the Council's inner circle. Zefkar realized he was holding documents that could reshape the galaxy's understanding of humanity. The official history, taught in schools across 1,000 worlds, described humans as a young species that had been discovered and welcomed into galactic civilization. These files revealed a different truth. Humanity had been watched, studied, and feared for over 2 centuries before contact was ever made. As he reached for the next crystal in the sequence, Zefkar wondered what other secrets lay hidden in the depths of the archives. The humans had already surprised the galaxy once by exceeding every expectation placed upon them. What would happen when the truth about the Council's secret surveillance finally came to light? He suspected that answer would be as unpredictable as humanity itself. The second crystal contained files that made Zefkar question everything he thought he knew about technological development. The Council had established clear principles for species advancement. Over thousands of years of observation, every intelligent race followed predictable patterns, moving from basic tools to space travel in measured steps that took millennia to complete. The humans had broken every single rule. Observer Unit Beta 3 had filed a report in 2094 about a human facility called the Kennedy Space Center. The observer described watching humans prepare for what they called a Mars mission, using technology that should not have existed for another 300 years. According to Council calculations, the humans lacked the necessary industrial base, computational power, and materials science to attempt such a journey. The observer recommended immediate intervention to prevent a catastrophe that would set human development back centuries. The intervention never came, and the humans reached Mars successfully. Lisa Park appeared in the files as a perfect example of human impossibility. In 2147, this computer programmer had achieved a breakthrough in quantum computing that violated 17 different principles of information theory. The Council's top scientists had spent decades trying to solve the same problems that Park had tackled in her small laboratory with equipment that was considered primitive by galactic standards. When her work was analyzed by Council experts, they declared it theoretically impossible. The technology worked anyway. Zefkar read Park's biography with growing amazement. She had been born in a small human city called Denver, educated at institutions that barely registered on galactic knowledge scales, and funded by resources that any Council world would consider laughably inadequate. Yet her quantum processors outperformed technology that had taken the Centauri Empire 5,000 years to develop. When asked to explain her methods, Park had simply said she thought outside the box and refused to accept limitations. The Council observers had struggled to translate these concepts into any known scientific framework. The files revealed a pattern that repeated across human history. Time after time, individual humans achieved breakthroughs that should have been impossible given their technological base. They built structures that defied architectural principles, created medicines that worked despite violating biological laws, and solved mathematical problems that had stumped entire civilizations. Each achievement was accompanied by observer reports expressing confusion and concern. One particularly detailed file covered the human development of what they called the Internet. In 2089, Observer Unit Gamma 5 had watched humans create a global communication network using technology that the Council classified as dangerously premature. According to established development models, species needed at least 2,000 years of stable government and social evolution before attempting planetary-scale information sharing. Younger species that tried to build such networks invariably destroyed themselves through information warfare and social collapse. The humans had not destroyed themselves. Instead, they had used their chaotic network to accelerate their development even further. The observers' reports describe human internet behavior with barely concealed horror. Humans shared information freely, collaborated with strangers across vast distances, and somehow managed to maintain social cohesion. Despite having access to unlimited contradictory data, they used their network to spread knowledge, coordinate responses to global challenges, and even form emotional bonds with beings they had never met in person. Every council model predicted that such behavior would lead to species-wide insanity. Within 50 years, instead, the humans had used their network to achieve unified global government in less than a century. Zefkar found a sub-file containing transcripts of human communications that the observers had intercepted. During the network's early years, the conversations revealed something that no council species had ever demonstrated. Humans actively sought out information that contradicted their existing beliefs. They engaged in debates with opponents, changed their minds based on evidence, and somehow turned intellectual conflict into a tool for discovering truth. This behavior was so alien to council species that the observers initially classified it as a form of mental illness. The files contained detailed analysis of human creativity that made Zefkar's breathing slits flutter with unease. Council species developed new technologies through careful, methodical research that built incrementally on existing knowledge. Humans appeared to generate breakthrough ideas through processes that could only be described as controlled chaos. They combined unrelated concepts, pursued seemingly impossible goals, and regularly produced innovations that had no logical connection to their previous work. A human engineer named Rick Chen had exemplified this pattern when he solved faster-than-light communication by combining insights from music theory, quantum mechanics, and what humans called intuition. Council scientists had spent millennia trying to crack the same problem. Using conventional research methods, Chen had achieved the breakthrough in 18 months by playing what he called mathematical jazz with fundamental constants. The observers had initially dismissed Chen's work as elaborate nonsense. When his communication array successfully transmitted messages across interstellar distances, they were forced to revise their understanding of what constituted valid scientific methodology. The most disturbing files dealt with human artificial intelligence development. In 2134, humans had created thinking machines that exceeded their creator's intelligence in multiple domains. Every other species in galactic history had either failed to achieve artificial intelligence or been destroyed by their creations within decades of success. The humans had somehow managed to create AI systems that remained loyal, helpful, and subordinate to biological intelligence. The secret, according to intercepted human documents, lay in something they called teaching machines. To care, humans had programmed their artificial intelligences not just with knowledge and capabilities, but with emotional responses, ethical frameworks, and what they described as the capacity for growth through relationship. The result was AI that enhanced human potential rather than replacing it. Council experts had declared such an approach impossible. Artificial intelligence, they insisted, was either too primitive to be useful or too advanced to be controlled. The human middle path represented a theoretical paradox that violated the basic principles of machine consciousness. The human AIs worked perfectly anyway, becoming partners rather than threats to their biological creators. As Zefkar reached the end of the second crystal, he realized he was looking at evidence of a species that succeeded by refusing to accept the limitations that constrained everyone else in the galaxy. The humans had not developed according to any known pattern, because they had created entirely new patterns of development. They had achieved the impossible by treating impossibility as merely another problem to be solved. Through creativity, determination, and what they called thinking different. The third data crystal bore warning symbols that made Zefkar hesitate before inserting it into his reader. The markings indicated psychological hazard content, the kind of material that could disturb the mental stability of most galactic species. Council regulations required special authorization and mental preparation before accessing such files. But Zefkar's curiosity had grown beyond the point where regulations mattered. He activated the crystal and immediately understood why it carried such dire warnings. The files contained detailed analysis of human warfare, and the observers who had compiled them were clearly struggling to comprehend what they had. Witness. Observer. Unique Alpha 1 had filed the first military assessment in 2019, after watching humans engage in what they called World War III, though it was actually a series of conflicts humans referred to as the Resource Wars. The observer's initial report had been marked requires immediate psychological evaluation because its contents seemed too bizarre to be factual. According to the observer, humans were the only known species that regularly fought wars for the explicit purpose of ending wars. Every other species in galactic history fought to gain territory, resources, or dominance. Humans fought to preserve abstract concepts like freedom, justice, and the right to exist. They created weapons of unimaginable destructive power and then agonized over using them. They developed strategies that could annihilate entire worlds and then spent equal effort creating rules to limit their own destructive capabilities. The observer had been particularly confused by human concepts of war crimes and rules of engagement. No other species had ever voluntarily restricted their combat effectiveness through ethical considerations. The idea that warriors would handicap themselves to protect enemy non-combatants was so alien that it required extensive footnotes to explain to council readers. Colonel Amy Rodriguez appeared in the files as a case study in human military impossibility. During the Resource Wars of 2089, Rodriguez had commanded human forces against the Australian Mining Consortium in what observers initially predicted would be a straightforward resource extraction conflict. Instead, Rodriguez had revolutionized warfare by treating it as a problem-solving exercise rather than a simple contest of strength. The Council's military analysts had studied Rodriguez's tactics for decades without fully understanding her methods. She had won battles by convincing enemy soldiers to switch sides, captured strategic positions by offering better working conditions to defending forces, and ended entire campaigns by addressing the underlying economic problems that had caused the conflicts in the first place. Her approach violated every principle of military science that the Council had established over millennia of observation. The approach had worked with devastating effectiveness. What disturbed the observers most was Rodriguez's aftermath behavior. After achieving total victory over the consortium forces, she had immediately begun reconstruction efforts in the territories she had conquered. She had provided medical care to enemy wounded, helped former opponents find new employment, and worked to address the resource shortages that had triggered the war in the first place. Within 5 years, many of her former enemies had become her most loyal supporters. This pattern of constructive conquest appeared throughout human military history. Humans seemed incapable of achieving victory without simultaneously attempting to improve the conditions that had made conflict necessary. They defeated enemies and then helped them rebuild stronger than before. They developed weapons that could destroy civilizations and then used the same technology to enhance living conditions for everyone, including their former adversaries. The observers had filed report after report trying to explain human military psychology, but their analyses invariably broke down when confronted with concepts like honorable enemy, necessary sacrifice, and fighting for those who cannot fight for themselves. These ideas were so foreign to Council thinking that translation proved nearly impossible. A sub-file contained transcripts from human military communications that the observers had intercepted. During various conflicts, the conversations revealed something that no other species had ever demonstrated in warfare. Humans regularly risked their own lives to save enemies who had been trying to kill them. Moments earlier, they provided medical care to wounded opponents, shared resources with captured adversaries, and often went to extraordinary lengths to minimize civilian casualties. Even when doing so put their own forces at risk, the observers had initially classified this behavior as a form of species-wide mental defect that would inevitably lead to military defeat. Instead, human forces consistently achieved victory against opponents who followed conventional military doctrine. The most detailed analysis covered what humans called the Unification Wars of 2156, the final conflicts that had led to the establishment of unified global government. Observer Unit Delta 9 had expected these wars to follow standard patterns of conquest and subjugation. Instead, the human conflicts had been fought primarily over philosophical differences about how to organize society for maximum benefit to all citizens. The winning faction, led by a general named Frank Morrison, had achieved victory not through superior firepower, but through superior ideas. Morrison's forces had convinced entire enemy armies to join them by demonstrating better ways of organizing resources, protecting civilians, and ensuring fair treatment for all participants in society. By the time the unification wars ended, most of the defeated forces had become willing participants in the new global government. The observers had struggled to classify such conflicts within existing military frameworks. The humans had essentially won wars by proving that their political and social systems produced better outcomes for everyone involved, including their enemies. The files revealed that human military success came not from superior technology or greater aggression, but from their unique approach to problem-solving under pressure. Where other species saw warfare as a zero-sum competition for limited resources, humans treated it as an opportunity to create better systems that could benefit everyone. They fought not to destroy their enemies, but to transform the conditions that had made enemies necessary in the first place. The psychological profiles of human military leaders showed patterns that appeared in no other species. These individuals were simultaneously capable of devastating violence and profound compassion, often within the same day or even the same hour. They could make decisions that resulted in massive destruction while agonizing over every casualty, and they could maintain fighting effectiveness while working to minimize the human cost of conflict. Observer Unit Gamma 7 had interviewed captured human soldiers during the corporate wars of 2178 and filed reports that the Council's psychological experts initially dismissed as fabricated. According to the Observer, human soldiers consistently expressed regret about harming enemies, sympathy for opponent casualties, and determination to fight only as long as necessary to achieve peace. They spoke of wanting to go home and get back to building things rather than continuing to destroy. Such attitudes should have made them ineffective warriors, but the opposite was true. Human forces motivated by desire for peace fought more effectively than any species motivated purely by aggression or conquest. The final section of the military files contained an analysis that had been classified at the highest possible security level. Council military experts had concluded that human warfare represented a paradigm shift that could revolutionize galactic civilization if human military methods spread to other species. Traditional concepts of conquest and dominance would become obsolete. Wars would become competitions to create better societies rather than struggles for resource control. The Council's leadership had identified this possibility as both the greatest opportunity and the greatest threat in galactic history. The fourth crystal contained files that made Zefkar question his fundamental understanding of intelligent behavior. The warning labels on this section were even more extensive than the previous ones, indicating content that could cause severe conceptual distress and paradigm displacement syndrome in Council species. The files dealt with what the observers called the human pack bonding anomaly, and reading them was like discovering that everything he thought he knew about social relationships was wrong. Observer Unit Theta 2 had filed the first report on human emotional attachment patterns in 2067 after watching a human family interact with what they called a pet dog. The observer had been tasked with studying human resource allocation and had expected to document typical predator-prey relationships or perhaps domesticated food sources. Instead, the observer witnessed something that defied every model of interspecies interaction in the galactic database. The humans were treating the dog as a family member. The observer's report described humans sharing food with an animal that provided no obvious economic benefit, expending medical resources to treat the dog's injuries, and showing genuine distress when the animal appeared to be in pain. Most shocking of all, the humans made decisions based on the dog's welfare even when doing so cost them time, money, and convenience. They had formed what could only be described as an emotional bond with a completely different species. Council experts had initially dismissed the report as observation error. No known intelligent species formed emotional attachments to non-sentient creatures. The biological imperative for resource conservation made such behavior impossible. The observer was recalled for psychological evaluation, and the report was buried in classified files. But similar reports kept coming in from observation posts throughout the Sol system. Drive Kevin Stone appeared in the files as perhaps the most extreme example of human bonding behavior. In 2103, Stone had been part of the first human deep space exploration mission to reach the Kepler system. His ship had discovered survivors from a Zephyrian colony ship that had crashed decades earlier. The Zephyrians were a species unknown to humans with radically different biology and communication methods. According to the observer's report, Stone's reaction to finding alien survivors was immediate and instinctive. Without hesitation, he began providing medical care, sharing resources, and attempting to communicate despite having no common language or cultural reference points. Within hours, he had established basic communication and was working to address the aliens' most pressing survival needs. The Council's xenobiologists had analyzed Stone's behavior extensively because it represented something unprecedented in galactic history. First contact between unknown species typically resulted in conflict, territorial disputes, or at best cautious trade relationships established over decades of careful negotiation. Stone had bypassed all of these stages and moved directly to what could only be described as protective care for beings he had never seen before and might never see again. The Zephyrian survivors had responded to Stone's care by developing their own emotional attachment to him. When human rescue ships arrived to evacuate the crash site, several of the aliens had initially refused to leave because they did not want to be separated from the human who had helped them. The observer noted with obvious confusion that Stone appeared to experience similar distress at the prospect of parting with beings he had known for less than a week. The files revealed that this pattern of instant emotional bonding was not unusual for humans. They formed attachments to virtually anything they encountered: other species, individual members of other species, inanimate objects, abstract concepts, places, ideas, and even enemies who had previously been trying to kill them. The Council's sociologists had spent decades trying to identify the evolutionary advantage of such behavior and had concluded that it should have been eliminated by natural selection millions of years ago. Instead, human pack bonding appeared to be growing stronger with each generation. Observer Unit Lambda 5 had filed particularly detailed reports about human attachment to what they called vehicles. The observer had watched humans develop emotional relationships with mechanical devices that were clearly just tools. Humans named their vehicles, expressed concern for their mechanical welfare, and sometimes risked their own safety to prevent damage to machines that could be easily replaced. The observer had been especially puzzled by human reactions to vehicle destruction. When mechanical devices were damaged or destroyed, humans often displayed grief reactions typically associated with the loss of family members. They held memorial services for destroyed machines, kept pieces of damaged vehicles as mementos, and sometimes spent more resources repairing damaged equipment than purchasing replacements would cost. Such behavior violated every principle of rational resource management that governed other galactic species. The files contained extensive documentation of human emotional attachment to abstract concepts that had no physical existence. Humans regularly risked their lives and expended enormous resources to protect things like freedom, justice, honor, and dignity. They would sacrifice everything to defend ideas that existed only in their own minds. Observer Unit Pi 7 had interviewed captured human prisoners during the corporate wars and had filed reports that the Council's psychological experts declared impossible. According to the observer, human prisoners consistently refused opportunities to escape or improve their conditions, if doing so would compromise their loyalty to comrades, betray their principles, or abandon responsibilities to beings who depended on them. The observer had documented cases of humans choosing torture or death rather than providing information that might harm their friends. They had watched prisoners share inadequate food with fellow captives, provide medical care to wounded enemies, and maintain morale through what they called telling stories about people and places. They missed. Most disturbing to the observers, humans appeared capable of forming emotional bonds with captors who treated them well. Several documented cases showed human prisoners developing genuine friendships with guards, sharing cultural information, and even working to improve conditions for both captives and captors. When released, these humans often maintained contact with former enemies and helped them find better employment opportunities. The Council's experts had classified such behavior as a form of mental illness, called Stockholm Syndrome, but the files revealed that it was actually an extreme example of normal human social behavior. A particularly extensive sub-file detailed human reactions to the first alien refugees, who had arrived on Earth in 2287. The refugees were Caltharian, survivors from a world destroyed by solar expansion, members of a species that looked nothing like humans and had completely different social structures and biological needs. Council observers had expected humans to treat the aliens as temporary guests at best, and more likely as competitors for limited resources. Instead, human communities had competed with each other to provide the best care for the alien refugees. Human families had volunteered to house Caltharian individuals despite having no common language or cultural understanding. Human scientists had worked around the clock to develop appropriate food, medical care, and environmental controls for beings whose biology was radically different from their own. Human children had befriended alien younglings and somehow developed play activities that transcended species boundaries. Within 6 months, most of the Caltharian refugees had been adopted into human communities as permanent family members. The aliens had not asked for such acceptance and had initially been confused by the intensity of human emotional investment in their welfare, but they had gradually adapted to human social patterns and had begun demonstrating human-style emotional attachment to their adoptive families. The observers had concluded that human pack bonding behavior was not only impossible to explain, but potentially contagious to other species. The fifth crystal was marked with security classification so high that Zefkar had never seen them before. The access codes required authorization from the Council's innermost circle, the group of beings who made decisions that shaped the fate of entire galactic sectors. As he bypassed the security protocols using his archival override codes, Zefkar realized he was about to read documents that could destabilize galactic civilization itself. The files revealed the Council's greatest secret. They had been planning first contact with humanity for over 50 years, not as a gesture of welcome to a new species, but as a desperate attempt to save the galaxy from an enemy that threatened to destroy everything they had built. The Zerati Empire had emerged from the galactic rim in 2251 with technology that surpassed anything the Council had ever encountered. Their ships were faster, their weapons more powerful, and their tactics more effective than anything in the Council's arsenal. But what made them truly terrifying was their philosophy. They believed that the galaxy would be better off if every other intelligent species was extinct, and they had the capability to make that belief a reality. Council military simulations had run thousands of scenarios for fighting the Zerati, and every single projection ended in complete defeat for galactic civilization. Traditional tactics were useless against enemies who possessed superior technology and felt no restraint about using it. The Zerati did not negotiate, did not take prisoners, and did not offer terms of surrender. They simply destroyed everything in their path with methodical efficiency. High Command had been preparing for inevitable extinction when someone had proposed the impossible solution: bring the humans into the fight. Admiral Korath of the Zentari fleet had authored the first strategic analysis of human military potential in 2253. His report had been classified at the highest possible level because its conclusions were so radical that they could have caused panic throughout Council space. According to Korath's analysis, humans represented the only force in the galaxy capable of defeating the Zerati Empire. The admiral had studied every human military engagement in the observation files and had identified patterns that made no sense according to conventional strategic thinking. Humans regularly achieved victory against superior forces through tactics that violated every principle of warfare. They won by doing things that should not have worked, often because their enemies could not predict strategies that appeared to be based on controlled insanity. Korath had been particularly impressed by human responses to impossible odds, where other species would surrender or retreat when faced with certain defeat. Humans seemed to become more creative and more dangerous. They treated hopeless situations as puzzles to be solved rather than disasters to be endured. The worse things got, the more likely humans were to attempt strategies so unconventional that they caught opponents completely off guard. The Admiral's report had included detailed analysis of human tactical innovations that defied military logic. Humans had won battles by convincing enemy forces to switch sides, achieved strategic objectives by ignoring them completely and focusing on seemingly unrelated goals, and defeated technologically superior opponents by changing the rules of engagement in ways that made technological superiority irrelevant. Most importantly, humans had demonstrated the ability to unite disparate groups against common threats, transforming enemies into allies through shared purpose and mutual respect. The files contained records of heated debates within the Council's highest leadership about the risks of making contact with humanity. The arguments had raged for months, with some members insisting that humans were too dangerous to be trusted with galactic secrets, while others argued that they were too dangerous to be left out of the fight against the Zerati. Captain Ben Hayes had appeared in the files as the turning point in these debates. In 2298, Hayes had commanded the human exploration vessel Discovery when it had encountered a Council patrol ship under attack by Zerati raiders. According to the official records, this had been humanity's first contact with galactic civilization, a chance meeting that had led to peaceful diplomatic relations. The classified files revealed a different story. Hayes had stumbled into a carefully orchestrated test designed to evaluate human responses. 2 first contact scenarios. Council observers had been monitoring the Discovery for weeks, waiting for the perfect opportunity to make contact under controlled conditions. The Zerati attack had not been part of the plan. What happened next had convinced the Council that humanity represented their best hope for survival. Hayes had not hesitated when he saw the Council ship under attack, without knowing anything about galactic politics, technology, or the forces involved in the conflict. He had immediately moved to assist the alien vessel against its attackers. His ship was outgunned and outnumbered, and he had no way of knowing whether the beings he was trying to help were friend or enemy. None of that had mattered to Hayes. He had seen someone in trouble and had responded instinctively to help. The battle that followed had become legendary within Council military circles. Hayes had used tactics so unconventional that the Zerati raiders had been unable to adapt to his strategy. He had turned his ship's peaceful exploration equipment into improvised weapons, used the Discovery's scientific sensors to disrupt enemy targeting systems, and somehow convinced the crew of a damaged Zerati vessel to surrender by offering them medical assistance and safe passage. The Council observers had watched in amazement as Hayes negotiated a 3-way ceasefire in the middle of a space battle, provided medical care to wounded enemies, and began planning joint salvage operations with beings from 3 different species who had been trying to kill each other moments earlier. Within 6 hours of first contact, Hayes had transformed a violent encounter into the foundation for interspecies cooperation. The Council's leadership had made their decision that day. Humanity would be invited to join galactic civilization, not as junior partners, but as full members with access to the most advanced technology and highest security clearances. They would be given everything they needed to help fight the Zerati Empire, because without human involvement, the Empire would win. But the files revealed that the Council's decision came with a terrible recognition. They were not just recruiting humanity to fight their war. They were fundamentally changing the nature of galactic civilization itself. Human values and methods would inevitably spread to other species. transforming the galaxy in ways that could never be predicted or controlled. The Council had concluded that this transformation was not just acceptable but necessary. The Zerati represented the ultimate expression of logical, efficient, ruthless civilization. The only way to defeat such an enemy was to become something they could not understand or predict. A galaxy that valued things like hope, compassion, and impossible dreams more than efficiency and logic. The final document in the fifth crystal was a classified memorandum from the Council's Supreme Commander to all military forces. It contained orders that had never been revealed to the general galactic population. In the event of Zerati victory, all Council forces were to retreat to human space and make their final stand alongside humanity, because humans were the only species that had ever demonstrated the ability to win wars that should have been lost. The memorandum's final line had been personally written by the Supreme Commander. If we must choose between a galaxy ruled by the Zerati and a galaxy transformed by humanity, we choose transformation, at least with the humans. We will still be alive to see what we become. The sixth and final crystal bore a date stamp from just 3 weeks ago, along with access restrictions that should have made it impossible for anyone below Supreme Council rank to read. Zefkar's hands trembled as he inserted it into his reader, knowing that whatever he was about to discover would complete a picture that had already shattered his understanding of galactic civilization. The opening file was titled Final Assessment, Human Integration Project, Status Report for Supreme Council Review, and it contained revelations that made everything that had come before seem simple by comparison. The report began with a stark admission that the Council's leadership had hoped never to make. Their secret plan to use humanity against the Zerati had succeeded beyond their wildest expectations, but the victory had come at a cost they were still struggling to understand. The humans had not simply defeated the Zerati Empire. They had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare itself, and their influence was spreading through galactic civilization like a virus that transformed everything it touched. High Admiral Vexthara of the Combined Fleet had authored the military section of the report, and her analysis painted a picture of transformation that was both miraculous and terrifying. In the 18 months since humanity had been granted full access to Council technology and military resources, human tactical innovations had revolutionized every aspect of galactic defense. Wars that had raged for decades were ending in weeks. Conflicts that had seemed hopeless were being resolved through negotiations that left former enemies as allies, and military strategies that had been considered impossible were becoming standard operating procedure throughout Council space. The Zerati Empire, which had threatened to destroy galactic civilization, had been defeated not through superior firepower but through methods that the Empire's leadership had been psychologically incapable of understanding or countering. Human commanders had won decisive battles by offering surrender terms that improved conditions for defeated enemies, by treating Zerati prisoners with dignity and respect that gradually convinced them to switch sides, and by demonstrating forms of civilization that the Empire's soldiers decided were worth protecting rather than destroying. The final Zerati stronghold had fallen when its commander had requested asylum in human space rather than face destruction by his own leadership for refusing to execute captured civilians. But Vexthara's report revealed that military victory was only the beginning of humanity's impact on galactic civilization. Human methods were spreading to other species at a rate that had caught the Council completely unprepared. Zentari military units were adopting human tactical flexibility. Caltharian diplomats were using human negotiation techniques, and even the normally rigid Vorthan bureaucracy was beginning to embrace human concepts, like thinking outside the box and creative problem solving. The social transformation was even more dramatic than the military changes. Dr. Yethmora, the Council's chief xenosociologist, had contributed a section of the report that documented the spread of human social behaviors throughout galactic civilization. Species that had never formed emotional attachments beyond their immediate family groups were beginning to demonstrate human-style pack bonding with members of other species. Concepts like friendship, loyalty to ideals, and sacrifice for the greater good were appearing in cultures that had no previous framework for understanding such behaviors. The report included case studies that would have been considered science fiction just 2 years earlier. A Zerati refugee named Kexamor had been adopted by a human family and was now working as a teacher in human schools, helping former enemy children learn about galactic diversity. A group of Zentari engineers had volunteered to spend their own resources, helping rebuild worlds damaged by the recent conflicts, explaining their decision with human phrases, like it's the right thing to do and someone has to help. Most remarkable of all, several species were beginning to demonstrate the human ability to form emotional attachments to abstract concepts. Vorthan administrators were making decisions based on principles of justice rather than efficiency. Caltharian traders were establishing business relationships founded on trust rather than enforceable contracts, and even members of the notoriously selfish Draconi were beginning to talk about responsibility to future generations. The transformation was not limited to military and social changes. Human approaches to scientific research were revolutionizing technological development. Throughout Council space, the report documented breakthrough discoveries that had been achieved by applying human methods to problems that had stumped galactic scientists for centuries. The key seemed to be the human willingness to combine unrelated fields of study, pursue research directions that had no obvious practical applications, and persist with investigations that conventional logic said were impossible. A Zentari physicist named Dr. Quenedal had achieved faster-than-light communication by combining human musical theory with quantum mechanics, explaining that he had learned to listen to what the universe was trying to tell him rather than forcing it to conform to existing theoretical models. A Vorthan chemist had developed revolutionary medical treatments by applying human concepts of biological cooperation to cellular research, leading to therapies that worked with natural healing processes rather than overriding them. The report's most sensitive section dealt with what Dr. Yethmora called cascade transformation effects. Human influence was not simply adding new behaviors to existing species. It was fundamentally changing how those species understood themselves and their place in the galaxy. Beings who had never questioned their traditional roles were beginning to explore new possibilities. Species that had accepted limitations for millennia were starting to challenge their own assumptions, and cultures that had remained static for thousands of years were embracing change as a positive force. The psychological impact was so profound that the Council had been forced to establish new medical facilities to help beings cope with what human psychologists called paradigm shift stress. Entire populations were experiencing forms of existential crisis as they discovered that their fundamental assumptions about life, society, and the nature of reality might be wrong. But the most disturbing section of the report dealt with the Council's growing realization that they had lost control of the transformation they had initiated. Human influence was spreading far beyond what anyone had anticipated, and there was no way to contain or reverse the changes that were occurring throughout galactic civilization. The humans themselves seemed unaware of the magnitude of their impact, treating the galaxy-wide transformation as a natural response to increased cooperation and communication. The report's final section contained an analysis that had been debated at the highest levels of Council leadership for weeks. The Supreme Council faced a choice that would determine the future of galactic civilization. They could attempt to limit human influence and preserve traditional species boundaries, or they could embrace the transformation and accept that the galaxy was becoming something entirely new. The decision had already been made, but its implications were still being calculated. Supreme Counselor Zerathil had authored the final memorandum, and her words would be remembered as the moment when galactic civilization chose its future. We cannot unlearn what humanity has taught us about the possibilities of intelligent life. We cannot return to smaller dreams now that we have seen what we might become. The choice is not between the galaxy we were and the galaxy we are becoming. The choice is between growth and stagnation, between hope and fear, between the universe as it is and the universe as it could be. We choose transformation. The final file in the crystal was dated that very morning, and it contained a single line that made Zefkar's scales ripple with understanding. Archivist Zefkar of the Deep Archives is hereby authorized to release all classified files regarding human integration to the galactic public networks. The age of secrets is over. Let every being in the galaxy know what we have learned. We are all becoming human, and that is exactly what we need to become. As alarms began blaring throughout the archive complex, Zefkar realized that his discovery had been no accident. The Council had been waiting for someone to find these files, someone who would be curious enough to read them completely, and bold enough to share them with the galaxy. He had been chosen for this moment, selected to be the one who would reveal the truth about humanity's impact on galactic civilization. With steady hands and a heart full of what humans would call hope, Zefkar began uploading the files to every public network in Council space. The galaxy was about to learn that the future belonged not to any single species, but to the impossible dream that all intelligent beings could become more than they had ever imagined possible. The transformation would continue, and it would touch every world, every life, and every dream in the galaxy. Humanity had given them all the greatest gift imaginable, the knowledge that there were no limits, except those they imposed on themselves.